I'm easily wowed by magic tricks. My favourite kind aren't the super elaborate ones with, really fancy props, but the humble card trick. That's my favourite one. I saw one at a conference recently. There was a degree of chaos as the person running the trick had many participants, and all these sorts of things seemed to be going wrong at the time, only for the right card to come out at the end of it. Blows my mind every single time. I marvel at how behind all that drama, the magician is in control the whole time. And there is something of that experience and that dynamic in the events that are recounted for us in these last chapters of Mark's Gospel. That though to the disciples at the time and to us, the readers today, there are all sorts of things going wrong for Jesus. Jesus is being undermined by everyone around him, including those closest to him. This is all part of a greater plan. Now, when I say there is something of that card trick in these events of Mark 14, I really stress the something. A card trick, after all, is contrived, isn't it? The audience is actually manipulated and misdirected by the magician so that they can do his or her reveal. That is not what is happening in the events that we read here. In the last days and hours of Jesus' earthly life and ministry, objectively terrible and sinful things happen to Jesus. Those undermining Jesus aren't simply actors given a script and a prescribed part, and they just play it out. They're real people with real wills making real decisions to undermine Jesus. And that is the same for us as we continue to live in this world today. The disappointments and the injustices and the calamities that we experience, they're not contrived. They are very, very real. We know that. We live in a fallen world. Genuinely sinful and terrible things happen. We are fully embodied beings with a real will who can make real decisions. Good, bad, wise, unwise. We know this from all our decision-making experience. We know this is true. And yet, when we look closely at the events of Mark 14, one of the clearest truths that flows out of it is that none of this takes Jesus by surprise. Jesus is in control the entire time. And that is because Jesus is God. And God being God, he truly is sovereign. And in his uniquely sovereign wisdom, he is uniquely able to use even objectively terrible things and sinful human decisions to bring about his ultimately good purposes. And so that's what you and I are encouraged to see behind, as Hamish said, behind the drama of betrayal and denial in Mark 14. God's saving purpose. That's what we're encouraged to see. A saving purpose that is centered and anchored in Jesus' sacrificial death and his glorious resurrection. A sacrificial death he gives great visual significance to in the bread and the wine of what has now become known as the Lord's Supper. Well, in Mark's narrative, it's now time for the Passover. That's actually the festival. If you look back at the very beginning of chapter 14, in last week's passage, that's the festival that's referred to by the Jewish leaders, that they're really anxious about not causing a disturbance in if they arrest Jesus. It's upon us. The Passover took place once a year, had a designated start time, designated end time. There were certain rituals and meals that took place at certain times. And we read in verse 12 a bit of a timestamp that Mark gives us. So he says, on the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb. Now, technically, the lambs were sacrificed on Passover Day, the day before the Feast of Unleavened Bread. But what Mark's doing here is he's picking up the loose, popular speech of the time, which tended to combine the 2 days into one. And before he focuses on the meal itself, he includes this brief account of how the Passover meal got organised, of the two unnamed disciples who take some really good initiative. They go to Jesus and they say, what's the plan? We're visitors here in Jerusalem. What's the plan for actually celebrating the Passover? We've got to be inside at a certain time having this meal. And then Jesus gives them these very specific instructions, exactly where to go and to whom to speak and exactly what to say. And they do it and everything unfolds exactly as Jesus said it would. If you recall, it's very reminiscent of a similar mission he gave to two disciples back in chapter 11 as they prepared to enter Jerusalem, about going to get the donkey that he would ride on. And the point that Mark seems to be making is that whether Jesus had simply prearranged things or whether there's a supernatural knowledge and dimension to these plans, whether this is ordinary or extraordinary, Jesus is in control of events. Jesus is in control. That's what we get as we go into the meal itself. So that's a bit of the context that is established for us. And then what follows is another one of Mark the Gospel writer's recognised sandwiches. You know, where an event is sandwiched between the beginning and the end of another event, or between two events that are thematically linked. And this helps the spiritual significance of the combined events be more clear. And the first slice of this sandwich is Jesus' prediction of his betrayal. And so we read in verse 18. While they were reclining and eating, Jesus said, "I assure you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." You can just imagine the conversation around this table. There's probably been some Passover conversation, as is the meal, how it's supposed to go. Probably also some general chit-chat. And then Jesus says this. Talk about a hard gear change. You can imagine the shock of this revelation as it ripples around the table. It's no surprise we're told the disciples are distressed by this. It's no surprise that uniformly they say, "Surely not I, how can this be? I've been following Jesus for 3 years. I'm going to betray him? What are you talking about?" They all deny it. They all deny it. Mark makes a point, doesn't he, of saying one by one they denied it, which includes Judas. Judas knows that Jesus is speaking the truth. He knows that he has already made plans to betray Jesus, as we saw last week. And maybe he thinks Jesus is just making a wild, paranoid guess. Or maybe he does sense that Jesus just knows something. Either way, he's able to look Jesus in the eye and say, "Surely not I." He thinks he's fooling Jesus. He's only fooling himself. And there's clear control and certainty just in Jesus' prediction itself, isn't there? You know, not just that this will happen, but that it was always going to happen. So look at verse 21. "For the Son of Man will go just as it is written about him." He's most likely referring to Psalm 41, verse 9, which speaks of this, about the Messiah being betrayed by one close to him. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. I mean, this seems as close to a crossroads moment for Judas as anything. I think he really has an opportunity to change tack at this point. But in the end, he chooses to go ahead with his betrayal. Because as elsewhere in the Bible, human decision is a real thing. We are held responsible for the choices that we make. And the fact is, like all the decisions that you and I make, and we know we make those decisions, Judas makes his own choice. And yet God is sovereign over it, as he's sovereign over all things, because he is God. And that's why this betrayal does not take Jesus by surprise. It's a great evil. It's a devastating betrayal, and it will be judged. And yet it's still part of God's all-wise predestined plan. So that's the first slice of bread. And then following this devastating prediction of betrayal, the second slice of bread is Jesus' demoralizing prediction of desertion and denial by the rest of his disciples. And so this is after the meal. Jesus and his disciples, they break with Passover protocol. You weren't meant to go out during the meal. But they go out of Jerusalem onto the Mount of Olives just opposite it, the hill just opposite. By now, Judas is no longer with them. We know that from John's Gospel. And then Jesus says in verse 27, "All of you will run away, because it is written, I will strike the shepherd and the sheep will be scattered." Once again, we see the control, right? Because it is written. It's prophesied. And once again, we're reminded that God is uniquely able to use even objectively terrible things to fulfill his saving purposes. In the prophecy that Jesus quotes from Zechariah, who is doing the striking of the shepherd? I am. That's God speaking in the prophecy. God the Father will strike the Son. And as Jesus predicts, in response to this striking, all of the disciples will run away and leave him alone. And at this point, off the back of the prediction of betrayal and the prediction of abandonment, Peter can't take it anymore. Verse 29, Peter told him, even if everyone runs away, I will certainly not. Imagine him puffing his chest out at that point, maybe a slight tone of hurt in his voice. I'm kind of, I think of the contemporary kind of phrase of backing yourself, back yourself, which means to have confidence in yourself. And that has its place, having confidence in yourself. And Peter clearly backs himself here, doesn't he, as a faithful disciple. And it is probably true when we look at the gospel accounts that along with James and John, Peter had perhaps gotten to know Jesus that bit better than the other disciples. And so it's perhaps no surprise that he sees himself as just that bit more committed than the other disciples. Although when I read this, it's also a bit like kids with best friends, at primary school or at high school, simply can't ever imagine leaving one another. We'll be best friends forever. So naive. There is an immature naivety, isn't there, to Peter's declaration here? And there's that fundamentally misplaced self-confidence. Yes, self-confidence has its place, but there are times when it is woefully misplaced. There are times in sport when self-confidence is woefully misplaced. In a mismatch where you don't have the skills or the experience or the size and you make a mistake and it costs you the game, or worse, injury. Or maybe in work and study, you back yourself, but there's actually a fundamental lack of knowledge or expertise or training that you have that leads to a costly error. Or in life in general, misplaced confidence in your balancing ability as a teenage boy maybe, or in your driving ability. It can lead to disaster. This is certainly true in matters of faith. Spiritually, self-confidence is always woefully misplaced. It's always woefully misplaced. And Jesus knows this, and he sees through Peter's bravado. He knows how this will play out. Peter, you too will abandon me. In fact, you will actually abandon me in an even greater and more painful way. Verse 30, I assure you, Jesus said to him, today, this very night, before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. That is a prediction that is stunning in its precision. This night, 3 times you'll deny me. Before the rooster crows twice. Peter, you won't just run physically away from my presence like the rest. You'll deny that you have ever even known me. And you'll do it again and again. Peter refuses to accept it. Verse 31, we're told he kept insisting, if I have to die with you, I'll never deny you. And the rest of the disciples, they all say the same thing. Were they lying? Like Judas when he looked Jesus in the eye and said, surely not I. Were they lying? No. I don't doubt for a moment their sincerity, and I don't think Jesus did either. They just didn't know themselves well enough. But Jesus did. As he's shown numerous times before, because he is God, he is able to see into people's hearts. He knows people better than they know themselves. And that is a sobering truth. It's sobering to read about this prediction, just to see the bravado of the disciples, the spiritual, religious bravado. I just see so much of myself in them. Now that really hits me. We are, at sinful heart, faithless people. Even when we are sincere, we are unable truly to hold to our claims of faithfulness and commitment with one another, let alone with God. We know how easily we can sin against Jesus in thought, word, deed, in what we fail to do. It's one of the reasons why people used to criticise the lyrics of the praise and worship song Shout to the Lord. It was a very popular song, sung many churches for many years. But it has the line, forever I'll love you, forever I'll stand. Now, on the one hand, that is simply a poetic way of saying, this is my intention. In one sense, it is what all who turn to Christ say. I have decided to follow Jesus, no turning back. But it does also sound an awful lot like Peter's words here, doesn't it? Forever I'll love you. Forever I'll stand. I will never deny you. In the push and pull of daily discipleship, in our struggles against temptation and our tendency to self-preservation and self-interest, we know this simply isn't true. This simply isn't true. And that truth can be deeply demoralizing when the moment comes. But the other side of that truth is that Jesus knows this about us. He knows us better than we know ourselves. And that's why desertion and denial are not the final word on Jesus' disciples. You know, these disciples are restored. Jesus gives a hint of this in verse 28. But after I've been resurrected, I will go ahead of you to Galilee. Jesus will regather his faithless disciples, all of them who deserted him, even the one who denied him again and again. And so we're reminded here in this second slice of bread of the sandwich that Jesus does not call to himself perfect disciples because there is no such thing. If there were such a thing, Jesus would not have had to come to die in the first place. And that's what we're also wonderfully reminded of in the rich filling of this sandwich. How the whole point of Jesus' death is to deal with our human faithlessness, to accomplish what we by nature are simply unable to accomplish. And it begins with the Passover. The Passover was at the heart of Jewish identity, their identity as God's redeemed people. The meal and its various stages, it recounted God's miraculous deliverance of them from slavery in Egypt, led by the head of the family. They'd go through the story. Different elements would have different symbolic meanings, building to the climactic moment of the Passover itself, when the lamb's blood protected Israel's firstborn from God's judgment of death. Jesus and his disciples would have been intimately familiar with the meal's history, with its rituals, and with their special meaning. They'd done them their whole lives. It's part of who they were as God's people. And so it would have been a truly mind-blowing moment when Jesus said that all that history and all those rituals and all that special meaning was ultimately about him and what he was going to do, the profound and lasting spiritual rescue that he had come to bring about. And that is what he's doing. Make no mistake. It's a very conscious and deliberate fulfillment. So look at verse 22. As they were eating, he took bread, blessed and broke it, gave it to them and said, "Take it. This is my body." Jesus uses the unleavened bread of the Passover meal, which already had a meaning in that meal, to depict his breaking body, the breaking body that he will experience on the cross. And by distributing it among all his disciples, one loaf through to the many, it also points to the great unity that believers will share through Jesus alone. And then he takes the Passover wine, symbolizing the death of the Passover lambs, the blood painted on the door frames of the houses in Egypt. And he says that now his blood will be sacrificially shed, and that it will be shed for many. That is, on their behalf, for their benefit, for their salvation and deliverance. Blood not of a physical lamb, unblemished as it may be in the ordinary earthly way, but the blood of the Lamb of God, the perfect, holy, truly unblemished Son of God. Deliverance not from the physical bondage of slavery to a tyrant like Pharaoh, but deliverance from spiritual bondage to sin and its consequences. It's in this way that the Passover meal becomes the Lord's Supper. That's the first purpose of it. And then all of this will re-establish a covenant between God and his people. That's what makes it a new covenant, because it's being re-established. A covenant is a binding agreement between two parties. The old covenant involved God's commitment to his people, but also the equal expectation that his people would remain committed to him. But God's people could never keep their side of it. We are, at sinful heart, faithless people. And so God had promised a new covenant, one written on the hearts of his people, where God would deal with our sin once and for all. Most famously, this new covenant promise comes through the prophet Jeremiah in chapter 31. And it's this new covenant that means that you and I don't have to worry and despair about whether we can back ourselves spiritually. That means our faithlessness doesn't have to define us, and it doesn't have to destroy us. Because that's what faithlessness does. It can have that power over us. One form of faithlessness is saying, I don't believe in God. That's a form of faithlessness. Or maybe God's real, but I don't care for any claim he has over my life. I don't care about having a relationship with him. Disbelief is faithlessness. Kind of abandoning an existing commitment to God is faithlessness, as we've seen. But another form of faithlessness, and the sin that lies at the heart of it, can be trying to have that relationship with God on our own, in our own efforts, on our terms. It's what's fundamentally religion. There is great spiritual bravado in religiosity. It was seen, wasn't it, in the Pharisees and other religious leaders of Jesus' day. The spiritual version of backing yourself. And yet spiritually they couldn't have been further from God at that point. Making plans to kill the Son of God. And the disciples too, they backed themselves spiritually, didn't they? They were in the inner circle with Jesus. They had a special place. They'd been faithful to Jesus up to this point. And they relied on those credentials. But if that is where our trust really lies, if our spiritual confidence is in our religious credentials, then we are as far from God as the pagan worshipper and the atheist. Don't fall into that trap. Jesus has established a new covenant. It's his blood and righteousness that saves you. It's his blood and righteousness that will sustain you now and into eternity. The Lord's Supper at heart is a meal for sinners, not for achievers. It's a meal for sinners, not achievers. The prerequisite is need. As one writer points out, people who eat and drink have to recognise their need for food and drink. And taking this meal means recognising your need for Jesus' body and blood to save you. There's no other way to take it, because there's no other way to be saved. As an aside, there are interpretations that take Jesus' words here literally, that he is saying that the bread and wine of this meal are in some real manifested sense his body and blood. And without going into too much detail about this, yes, it is true that Jesus says, this is my body, this is my blood. But there are a couple of reasons why that's an unhelpful way of understanding Jesus' words. One is simply context. So Jesus describes the wine as his blood, absolutely. But then what does he immediately refer to wine as? The fruit of the vine. It's just ordinary wine. That's what he's talking about. And then there's the broader context. Jesus is appropriating an already symbolic meal. The unleavened bread wasn't the unleavened bread that they took out of Egypt. The blood wasn't the actual blood of the lambs painted on the door frames. It was just ordinary wine. So there's that context which just needs to be understood here. And also, if Jesus is being literal, that means that every time the Lord's Supper is celebrated, his body is broken and his blood is shed. That is, Jesus is in some sense re-sacrificed every single time. But that's not possible because it undermines what happened at the cross. And if you've been with us for a while, last year we spent a lot of time in the book of Hebrews, a part of the Bible that makes it clear that Jesus' death on the cross, his sacrifice for sin, was once and for all, never to be done again. Doesn't need to be done again. And so as an aside, the Lord's Supper should be understood as an outward and visible sign, a symbol of the grace shown to us in Christ. No more, no less. Lastly, why do we celebrate the Lord's Supper? As in, why do we do it ongoingly? After all, Mark's account here doesn't say anything about doing it ongoingly. Have you noticed that? How do we know this wasn't just a one-time special moment for the disciples present? Well, Luke's account does include Jesus' words where he explicitly says this is something to be doing ongoingly, to continue this meal as an act of remembrance. And this remembrance, it's affirmed by the Apostle Paul in his first letter to the church in Corinth in 1 Corinthians 11. Paul, who met the risen Lord, says, "For what I received from the Lord, I also passed on to you. On the night when he was betrayed, the Lord Jesus took bread, gave thanks, broke it and said, 'This is my body, which is for you. Do this in remembrance of me.' In the same way, after supper, he also took the cup and said, 'This cup is the new covenant established by my blood. Do this as often as you drink it in remembrance of me.'" We need remembrance. We need acts of remembrance. We need this act of remembrance for a couple of reasons. For one, we're just prone to forgetfulness. We are as people. I don't care how good your memory is. At times, there are things I have some good memory for, but we're all prone to forgetfulness. And sometimes with some things, we need regular reminders of past things that have present significance. We're finite, we're embodied, and we're sinful. And concrete acts of remembrance like this, they're helpful for not only remembering that the event happened, but remembering the significance of that event. And there is no greater event with no greater significance than the death of Jesus. And then every time we do this act of remembrance, this outward and visible sign, the Lord's Supper is able to be its own little proclamation of the heart of the gospel. It effectively preaches to all those who partake of it and witness it. As Paul concludes in his letter, "For as often as you eat the bread and drink the cup, you proclaim the Lord's death until he comes." So let's do that now together. Let's share bread and wine together, or in our case, juice. Let's feed on Christ in our hearts by faith with thanksgiving. Let's be faced again with God's love for the unworthy, for the faithless, but be strengthened by the faith in the one whose body was given and whose blood was shed for us. Amen.